Screens organized here. Welcome back. We are going to kind of skim through chapters 13 and 14 of John today. And you will remember we left off last week with Mary washing the disciples' feet, which we all agreed probably doesn't look like this beautiful German painting, but it is interesting. There's not as much art. I usually check the Vanderbilt Christian Art Library, and you can sort it by scripture. There's not as much art for John 13 and 14 as one would think, but perhaps it's out there and I'm just not finding it.
I think I sent you the picture that I had, which shows them laying on daises, on their left arms, and Mary's, doesn't have to get as low as this because Jesus' feet are, higher up on the dais, and to me, of course, was more representative of how they lived their life back then.
Yes, thank you for sending that and reminding us of that. I wonder if that
historical fiction, so I don't know if it's real, but women weren't eating at the same table with men. They were eating separately. So this would again been stunning to have a woman come up to the man's table and do this.
Yes, I think we have trouble keeping that in the forefront of our brain as we read all these stories. The women they didn't mingle with men. With their families, of course, they did, but not in a social gathering. So,
yes.
A different way.
Yes. So there are some stunning, I think that's an important reminder that there are some stunning parts of this that we have to keep our modern day minds in that space of some of these things are really radical and stunning and surprising for the times.
But the fact that Jesus spoke to that Samaritan woman at the well, I mean, that was a no-no.
Right. Yes. Thank you. So as we enter, I snipped a copy of your scan, Tim, from the New Interpreter's Bible here, but we're kind of entering some scholars have divided the book of John, and so we're sort of entering that second section or second book. And we have Jesus's final meal with the disciples, which we know doesn't look like the other synoptic gospels. And then we have this long farewell discourse. You all are excellent biblical scholars, so you probably already know this, but a farewell discourse is when a leader who's about to part from his people says, and I used he there because I think it's mostly men in the Bible that do this, but that there would be, sort of this talk about what's going to happen, their need for to reckon with their loss, and then encouragement for the struggle that lies ahead. And they often end with a prayer or a hymn, and that prayer happens in John 17, which we won't get to today, but it's sort of all there in this longer farewell discourse. And the New Interpreter's Bible points out that, from this point on, we're really talking about the hour and all that means. So that's where we're at. And I'm going to, I've narrowed things down today, so we're not going to read every word of John 13. Fair warning. But what I would like to do as we read this foot washing narrative, I think I have it on 4 slides, is maybe we'll read the whole narrative through at one time, and then we'll discuss it as a whole, because I think it's such a lovely narrative that I hate to interrupt it. So I'll let you all just jump in. You're good at that. If there's someone who wants to read this first one, and then, so this is John 13, 1 through 20.
I'll go ahead. Now before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, tied a towel around himself, Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus answered, you do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand.
Thank you.
Peter said to him, you will never wash my feet. Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no share with me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Jesus said to him, one who has bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you. For he knew who was to betray him. And for this reason he said, not all of you are clean.
Thank you. Diane, would you read this third one?
After he had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and had returned to the table, he said to them, do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example that you should also do as I have done to you. Very truly, I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. I am not speaking of all of you. I know whom I have chosen, but it is to fulfill the scripture. The one who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me. I tell you this now before it occurs, so that when it does occur, you may believe that I am he. Very truly, I tell you, whoever receives one whom I send receives me, and whoever receives me receives him who sent me.
Thank you. So that is chapter 13, 1 through 20. And there's a lot in 20 verses. So I don't know if there's a place that you all would like to begin. There are sort of several things here that we could focus on. One is the difference between this last meal versus the Synoptic Gospels and what that means for our understanding of the sacraments. There's also this idea of what does it mean to be a disciple, and so there's a lot of themes in here. So I'm going to open it up if there are particular things that stood out to you or questions that you have that you'd like to discuss. Oh, I see. Oh, go ahead, Diane, and then John, I see your hand up. You can go next.
My question is about different denominational practices. I grew up in a church where we had foot washing before communion every time, and we called it the ordinance of humility. And I always loved that term because it does make you humble to wash someone else's feet. And then when I grew up and I started going to other Protestant churches, no, people didn't do it. So is that the difference with the other Gospels, that only foot washing is here?
Right. So only foot washing is here, and there's no, breaking the bread, Last Supper. Well, I mean, it looks, it is a meal, but it looks different, right? It doesn't have the do this in remembrance of me kind of thing. Go ahead, Tim.
So Diane, what denomination was that?
Seventh-day Adventist.
Okay, I grew up in a Mennonite church, and in that tradition there are different strains. So you have, at the most conservative, Amish, then you have Amish Mennonites, then you have, moving toward liberality, you have Old Mennonite, which is what my mother was, and then you have General Conference Mennonite, which is what my father was. And I grew up in a General Conference church. My mother, who was born in 1923, even into the mid-60s, would do foot washing, but not before every communion, but before Good Friday. And when I was 14 and having been recently baptized, because the Mennonites do not baptize babies, my father asked me whether I wanted to do foot washing, and I declined. So in the mid-60s, there were people who were driving cars, and we were a few years away from Neil Armstrong landing on the moon, and we thought we were pretty modern. And yet, even at that time, my mother's entire family and my mother were doing foot washing. And as far as the text goes, I see a contrast being set up by the evangelist between Jesus serving his flock, protecting them, washing the feet on the one hand, and Judas Iscariot on the other hand, betraying Jesus and in effect betraying the entire group for 30 pieces of silver.
Right. And it's clear in this text that Jesus knows that Judas is going to do this and washes his feet anyway. John, you've had your hand up, so I want to make sure you get to. We're a formal group today.
Well, you know, we're also chatty. I'm struck by my friend Peter. Peter's one of my favorite apostles because his flaws are so evident, and his pettiness at times, and yet he was the preacher that brought more people into the kingdom than well, I won't say all the others combined, but he had
not more than Paul.
Talent. What?
Not more than Paul.
Well, we're not at Paul yet. Paul hasn't come along, so I'm just talking about his time with Jesus. And so that's one thing I observed. The other thing is, isn't this where the story is at the Last Supper, that before Jesus came in, the apostles were bickering over who was going to sit at the head of the table, you know, on the right hand of Jesus for the dinner, you know. And so Jesus walks in and he sees them all bickering. And then I think it was Peter decided, I'll sit at the foot, and then Jesus will ask me to come up the table. You know, I'd forgotten that they have, even at social events, there's a whole seating pecking order. You know, the most honored sits at the right hand of the host, etc. And so socially, you know, it's like where you sit is where you stand in the community. You know, so anyway, that's an aside about the social culture of the time. And yeah, washing the feet, you know, we say, well, wow, that's a deal. But also socially, you know, when you went to somebody's home, that was part of the ritual. You washed your feet because, you know, you got sandals on and your feet are dusty and what have you. So this was a common practice. It wasn't something unique to the Last Supper. But the meaning that Jesus gave to it, of course, was quite stunning. Thank you.
Right. And I think what might also be unique is, you know, foot washing was fairly common, but I think who did it, it was either the servant or the slave. It would be very rare for the host.
Right.
I mean, that's what's stunning about this, right? Is Jesus is the host, and Jesus has revealed himself to be, you know, the incarnate word, and he's washing. That's very unexpected, I think. But the ritual, not.
He's acting as a servant of his children. In other words, he's reversing the roles. He's not the high mighty, but he's doing and that's why Peter resisted. Says, "Oh no, you're not going to wash my feet, are you?" And of course, then he goes overboard and says, "Well, wash everything. Wash my head." You know, goofy.
Yes. Don, what were you going to say?
Yeah, the one line that we had talked about last time, is the devil around still, or is the devil not around still? And here, very clearly, it says the devil had already put into the heart of Judas, which is kind of a reminder of our conversation. Some think he had defeated Satan, and some think he defeated him, but he just resided in the world as well.
Yeah, did anybody do any reading or looking up the devil or Satan in this last week? I know we had that question a little bit. John? Yeah.
I did. I'm an old social worker. I got my MSW back in the 60s from Columbia University, and for about 12 years I did that. I think Judas' problem was his psychological problem. I don't think he was possessed by the devil. He was a grievance collector, so we've met people like that. Maybe you've worked with some people like that. They remember, what all the hurts. And, I maintain from my reading anyway, that when, Mary poured out that oil, which is worth a year's salary, that was the breaking point for Judas. He says, this is a waste. What is this man doing? Not stopping this, So I don't see the devil had a hand in it at all, but the Bible always does that. When something goes wrong, they blame it on the devil. I just blame it on human beings' weakness. We're weak. Well, sometimes.
Paul's letter to the Romans
Yeah.
says that evil and sin were tied to Adam when Adam went against God's commandments, and that Jesus was the sort of the New Testament analog to, or antithesis really, to Adam, because he represented the Father in a more saving context, so that we had Adam and sin and original sin, which is our own selfishness, which comes from our instincts for survival, if we believe in the Darwinian theories of evolution, and I do. So then Jesus came and introduced a more advanced way of obeying God and a way of achieving salvation.
The only
So I
thing
think evil is
to
in
add
all
to
of
that
us.
is that there are theologies or theological concepts that look at Jesus as the new Adam.
Yeah.
And
Son of man.
I'm not the one to explain that, but he is, everything is new in Jesus. That's, I think, the point. One of the points of that is, the world was changed. And what I take from this this chapter, I mean, it's such community, and I think Jesus is demonstrating that he wants us to live in community and serve each other. Because what greater thing can we do than to serve his creation, right? That goes back to Adam. He wanted Adam to take care of his creation, and Eve.
Can I add also that I love the parts in this chapter, as you're saying, Herb, that are about modeling for us how to behave towards one another. And Christine, you mentioned it lightly, but it's so powerful to me that Judas might have reached his breaking point when Mary, did the spikenard and all that, but he still came and ate dinner. He who ate bread with me will betray me. And what a model that is for us. We know when some people are not wishing us well in life, but we're not released from, how we interact with them. We still must wash their feet and serve them.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up that idea of community. When we think of Holy Communion, right, I think for me, that's where John resonates. It's not that he's breaking this loaf of bread and drinking the wine in John, but he is establishing this community in a new way. And then if you take that along with John 6, I am the bread of life, I think you can. Now, scholars have different opinions on this, but I think you can see I see a sacramental quality to John. Not everybody would agree with that, I think, and some of Tim's commentaries allude to that sort of ongoing discussion in theology. But yeah, John is rich and thick. If you want to understand who Jesus is, that's wonderful. And then it's going to lead you into this direction of, well, what is sin and what is evil and how do we wrestle with those things? And then how does Jesus overcome sin and evil? And there are different theological streams that answer that as well. And So, I'm kind of from the theological stream. I think of the devil as the personification of evil rather than, an actual entity. But, that's not the only view on that. So I don't want to promote it as that.
I want to respond to something John Hales said. I say John Hales because I'm not talking about the evangelist. And I can't find it, but I remember that when Judas was objecting to the use of an expensive perfume or oil or whatever it was, that that the evangelist says that it was not because he wanted to use the value to serve the poor. And
That's 12:6.
does anybody know where that was? Because it was just a parenthetical comment.
Chapter 12:6. He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used it to steal what was put into it.
Okay, and the word thief in Greek is the same as a betrayer, and one of the commentaries says that thief is not the best translation of what was written in Greek, but more that that he would betray Jesus. But the comment I was bringing up is that according to the evangelist, he did not care about the poor. So John Hales, is there another place where we read about this, like in the synoptics, for example?
As you know, I get much of my commentary from the Urantia book, so which is a revelation that was given us back in 1955, and it clarifies so many of these stories that are slightly off base. Judas, according to my source, was a very faithful. He carried the bag for 4 years. They call it the bag, the money bag, and he was not a thief, but he grew up to resent Jesus because he felt he was not being treated fairly. It was a psychological problem, and his betrayal because of course his home life was such that he was a pampered and spoiled child. He was an only child, so he started off with some strikes against him because he didn't know how to share. He didn't know how to love people and interact with people. But anyway, that's just my take on it. So but I fully understand why whoever wrote this part of the Bible, they wanted to emphasize that Judas was evil, and what better way than just accuse him of being a thief? That was
I
the
think
trail.
everyone can be in agreement that at the end Jesus was left alone.
Well, his father didn't leave him alone.
But
I mean, our father and his father, he wasn't alone, and he was constantly in communion with him.
That's a different point than what I'm making.
Okay, I'm sorry if I misunderstood.
But I
But that's
think
what a hero does. They go places where no one else would go.
Mm.
And even amidst betrayal, they continue. And I think that's the segue. I don't know how many verses there are in chapter 13, but when we go to the next one, we start to see it did weigh on him, but he still went forward.
Yeah, my commentary says that greed was one of the early church's explanation for Judas's treachery. And they cite Matthew 26:15, and verse 6 of John can thus be read as continuing the vilification of Judas in the early Christian tradition. Yet the details of this description seem to serve another purpose. Judas is labeled a thief, the same word used to describe the one who threatens the flock. The expression, not because he cared about the poor, echoes the description of the hired hand's lack of care for the sheep in 10:13. The use of these words suggests that the description of Judas is intended to point the reader toward the proper context in which to place Judas's action. When he betrays Jesus, he's also betraying the sheep.
Yeah, so I think we what we're wrestling with here is what is sin, and especially sin in relation to community. When you betray your community or betray that trust in some way, whether it be greed or any number of ways, right? And that's what we wrestle with. What is that? What does that mean? How does it happen? What are the causes of it? And then how does that relate to evil? And that's a huge that is a huge theological wrestling. So I know, Diana, you alluded to, there's verses 21 through 31 that, start with, after saying this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and declared, very truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me. So there's a little bit of an explanation and discourse with the disciples, which I, in the interest of time, I'm kind of skipping over, because I think that for me, all of this is leading up to this new commandment, which is so important, and which we've talked about in terms of loving even those who you know are betraying you or who may wish you harm. And how do we do that as Christians? And what does that mean to be a disciple? So John Hales, would you read verses 31 through 35 in John 13, please?
31. The new commandment. Yeah. When he had gone out, Jesus said, now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another.
Yeah, thank you. And this word glorify comes up again. And for me, that's a really tricky word to sort of wrap my head around. A description that I read, or a definition that I read, was that, to glorify means to make God's presence visible. I don't know if others have another way or other definitions that help us to understand that complex word, glorify.
Well, I've always felt it was like you make it the central reality in your thinking, to glorify. I mean, the only person I glorify would be God. I wouldn't glorify. Well, I dated a couple of cute girls, but anyway, but seriously, that's what I consider glorification, is that it's number one. It's number one in my consciousness. Of course, not all the time, but that's it.
That's what I was going to say I was going to say that to me only applies to God when you glorify.
Right.
There isn't anybody else that would deserve that, I would say.
Not even the Grateful Dead.
But Don, then it says, now the Son of Man has been glorified. So what you said is how I would view these big concepts. But what do we do with verse 31, or verse 31a, I guess we would call it?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yep.
I don't know what to do with that, because to me, God should be the only one glorified. So I agree with the premise that you bring, but I'm sort of stuck on 31a.
Yeah. I see what you're saying. I always put Jesus as he was last day or two of his life as being glorified also, because he was actually going to God, and that's the reason I lumped him into that. But you make a
representative of God,
right,
or God's proxy.
right.
Diane, did you have your hand up about that?
I did, but wow, this is fascinating, because it's very different from my read of this. I'm still linking it to Now, when he, Judas, had gone out, Jesus said, now the Son of Man is glorified and God is glorified in him, and God, and goes forward. And I thought this was again the paradox. Jesus is saying, you think it's all about kingdoms here and big glory, but wait till you see what I am going to go through and do. And that's God's glory, is to give that kind of love to you. And I thought this paragraph was about helping the disciples understand the paradox of God's glory is the sacrifice that Jesus made.
Another approach might be that the Son of Man has been glorified. That could simply, I shouldn't say simply, but that might mean that his life was going to be sacrificed for the salvation of those who believe in him and in God. And that how we normally think of glorified, maybe that applies to 31b, talking about God. So the two words might mean different things. I'm trying to come back to Don's premise, which I embrace.
Right. So the idea that the only thing worthy of worship and glory is God, right? And then what is Jesus's relationship to God, right? And from chapter 1, John gives us a clue, right, about how John views who Jesus is. Jesus is the Word made flesh, God, God incarnate in some ways. And so that's how I read it.
He is God in human form.
Yeah, this is a hard concept in the sense you have Jesus was the Son of God and the Son of Man. He was both things at once. He was literally a Son of God from the Trinity, and at the same time, when he bestowed himself as a mortal, a baby, flesh and blood, he became the Son of Man, and he carried these two things through his entire life. So in what Tim was saying, and Jesus also told us, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So he has all the attributes of the Father. So for us, for all intents and purposes, he is God to us. I mean, so. Right. But he always said, no, don't worship me. Worship the one that sent me. So, he made that distinction clear. But
so if you believe in the Trinity, the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, then I think the chapter that's coming, Jesus is going to explain, I won't always be here physically, but I'm going to leave what the NRSV calls the advocate.
The Spirit of truth, his Spirit of truth.
The third member of the Trinity.
Right. And thank you, John, for holding up the mystery of the Christian faith, right? That Jesus was both God and human, and it's hard to wrap our heads around. And in some ways, I find relief in calling it a mystery, because God is greater than we can imagine, and so it's okay to sort of wrestle with what that means and the implications of that theologically, but that it is a beautiful mystery that invites us to know who God is.
Well, I think this is a story that's unfolding. It's unfolding before our eyes. And Jesus has a destination.
Yes, Jesus' destination.
Well,
let's we're gonna skip ahead a little bit to the destination, right? Herb, would you read John chapter 14, 1-7? This is a pretty well-known piece of John as well.
Sure. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to shrink this so I can read it, excuse me. In my Father's house, there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, so that where I am, there you may be also. and you know the way to the place where I am going." Thomas said to him, "Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way?" Jesus said to him, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you know me, you will know my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have seen him."
Thank you. So one of my favorite papers that I wrote in seminary was on this passage. And you all are so knowledgeable and astute that you noticed way back in chapter 2, this idea of my Father's house. This phrase only appears twice in John, right? When Jesus cleanses the temple, he says, my Father's, where is it? My Father's house. Da, 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 da. Wait, where to go?
There it is.
Oh, there it
Take
is.
things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace.
Right, thank you. There's a lot of text there. Yes, so, and if you remember, we talked about the understanding that God's presence was found in the temple. And here in chapter 2, it sort of moves, Jesus is moving this understanding of God's presence is not the temple, but the temple of Jesus's body, right? This in 3 days, so there's this movement. And in John 14, then if Jesus goes away, well, then where is God, right? So, and we have to think about the socio-historic context of when John was written. One of the major historical events that had happened not too many decades before was the destruction of the temple. So this Johannine community was grappling with, what does it mean that the temple where we understood God to be is destroyed? And then this human who was here is now also not here. How do we understand where God's presence is? And so, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and the other image that is yet to come, ahead of us, is when Jesus gives it up on the cross, the curtains of the temple are, what's the word, rent? They're torn apart. Did that actually happen? Who knows? But that's the theology of it, is that the temple's changed forever. Right.
And it's a clue to what questions this particular community at this particular place in time were grappling with. It would have been very traumatic to lose the temple and, just a generation before, lose this person who had taught so much and made such a huge impact. Probably understating that a little bit, but you know what I mean. So here he says, in my Father's house, there are many dwelling places. And there are different understandings of that relationship with God, or that understanding of a dwelling place. Some people think of it as some scholars think of it as of heaven or the temple. You might also think of it as a relationship. So one of the interesting things that the word used in John 2:16, the Greek word is oikos, which means it's limited just to the structure, even though in English, my Father's house is the same thing. It has a slightly different bent in John 2. But then in John 14:2, it says the structure or the household of relationships. So it's the same root word, but it's a little bit, it has the ability to allow us to expand our understanding of not just a structure, but also this relationship. So in my research, I really agree with that conclusion that scholars have, that this dwelling place is a relationship with God more so than we might think of as heaven or afterlife. But that's not to say there aren't other conclusions to be found here. Go ahead, Diane. Sorry, Diane, you had your hand up. And then John, excuse me.
She's muted.
I was going to say John had his hand up first. Well, I'll ask my question. Well, not here, but the thing about in my Father's house, there are many dwelling places. You just said the household of relationships, and we were talking about relationship of us to God. I know it's in my head somewhere. Some people use this to talk about the need to be inclusive in our relations with others and see that there are many paths to relationship with God. And I wondered if your research had any thoughts on, was that anything that was being grappled with when this was written? Do you understand my question?
Yeah, I do understand your question. And I don't know that I have an exact answer to that, but I do think, as this community was struggling with, this diversity of practices of Judaism and what it means to declare Jesus the Savior, right? That the evidence in the Gospel according to John is that there might have been some people who were being sent out of the temple. And we've seen that a couple times in earlier readings. So perhaps, I think that would be an interesting thing to dive deeper into is this helping us to have a more inclusive understanding of faith and relationship with God?
That would be a wonderful topic for adult education that you guys are looking for.
Well, the
Inclusivity.
Israelites in the desert, they thought God hovered just above the Ark of the Covenant, where the scrolls were, or the tablets.
If
So
I might,
over time.
if I might share with you a thought. And 2,000 years ago, our ancestors and our brothers and sisters of that time would look up at the heavens, and how would they understand that? Fast forward to now, with the Hubble telescope and other astronomers learning, we now know that there are many galaxies. They now know that there are worlds circling other suns. So to me, it's quite obvious when Jesus said, my Father's house has many mansions. These are other worlds. This is where he goes, and this is where we go, after we leave our mortal body behind. I mean, it's the ascension career. To me, it's just totally logical. And but if you just read the Bible, you get hamstrung, because they didn't have this perception, they didn't have this science, this knowledge, So, but he did speak poetically, if you will. My Father's house has been. I don't know which book they call them mansions, right? That there's one of the books that my Father's house. Maybe this interpretation calls it dwellings.
Yeah, the relationship idea though shows up in the Oxford Study Bible in a footnote. It says house, not a building, but a household relationships. Preparing a place means mediating relationship between God and disciples. Jesus never brings them to a place. Where I am is not the location, but relationship of mutual loyalty. And then to see Jesus is to see God, meaning to be in relationship with Jesus is to be such with God. So these footnotes suggest that the evangelist was not talking about someplace up in the clouds that would have many physical rooms.
I'm talking about worlds. I'm talking about physical worlds that we go.
Well, but it's the same idea that, beyond this terrestrial ball. So this suggests that the evangelist was not talking about a physical place, but relationships, which is what Christine mentioned a few minutes ago.
Right. And there are certainly, other interpretations. And I think that this is a beautiful passage read at funerals. And I don't want to take away from the comfort, in this passage, Jesus is talking about, the present time, here and now. And that's found throughout the Gospel of John, right? That the kingdom of God isn't just far away and after you die, but also here, but it is also far away and after we die. So there, I think there's some beauty to be found in the poetry, as John called it. I will end. Oh, go ahead, Herb.
Thy kingdom come.
Right. I will end with sort of a quiz question. Do you remember the first question in chapter 1 that was asked of Jesus? Where are you staying? Where are you staying? And Jesus says, come and see, right? So as Jesus is about to leave, that beautiful thread of where is God? Where are you? Where are you going? And Jesus answers, come and see. So in this relationship with God, we see this beauty and promise of life here and eternal life. So
That is a beautiful connection, Christine. Thank you for bringing that.
Very good. Very good point.
That's we'll give all that credit to my seminary professor just down the road in Garrett. But for me, that was just a really wonderful way to think, to sort of think about one of the main themes in John, especially as we get here. So I thank you for journeying with me. We made it through a little bit of 14. We'll skip ahead to the end of chapter 14 and continue on our journey through John. And we will end the Wednesday before Labor Day, and we are looking into adult ed options for June. So stay tuned. It may be an outside speaker in June. I have a couple weeks off that month, so or maybe some of you would like to lead a session. We'll stay in touch and find all that out.
Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks,
Take care.
everybody.
All right. Thank
It's
you.
always fun.